Hi everyone, it's Monica, and welcome back to Tailor-Made Cards for You. Well, today I have a special treat for you, and I'm going to be creating a card using one of the new Holtz Sizzix dies that came out recently. This is the die set called The Park, and as you can tell, it kind of has a Mary Poppins theme. It is a silhouette die, so what that means basically is it's intended to be all black, but certainly if you want to cut it out on colored cardstock or different type of printed cardstock, you can definitely do that as well. Now, I went the traditional route because, again, I am a vintage-inspired crafter, and I tend to like to stay with traditional designs. So I went ahead and I kept it as a silhouette. But I did a few other things on this card that I wanted to share with you in this video, just to kind of focus on some of the details. As you can see, this layout isn't very extravagant. It basically has two dies, and it has the moon and some washi tape. And really, that's it. But I wanted to focus on some of the details that kind of add to the card. The first thing I wanted to point out is the Mary Poppins figure. Now, this die, when you cut it, is very thin, but I ended up layering it 4 times because I wanted it to have some dimension. And you can do this with any of your Thinlits when you're cutting them out. If you want them to have more dimension, just simply cut them out and layer them one on top of the other. And I tend to cut it out on double-sided tape, so that way when I go to add my layers, it's really easy. Now, another thing that I do, especially when I'm working with silhouettes, is I like to have the better cardstock on top. And I like to use the blackout because you can sand it and then some of the Kraft will come through. But the blackout cardstock is a little bit more expensive than your traditional black cardstock. So when I am creating layers, I do put the cheaper cardstock on the bottom since it's not going to be shown, and then I just cut out one of the blackout pieces for my top layer. Now, another thing I do is just to at the end of the card when I'm putting it together, I just add some extras, and it's purely for design. As you can see, I added some washi tape here. And then I added little brads, and the brads can be twofold, right? They can all, of course, be used to hold some of your cardstock in place, but it could be also be decorative as well. Now, the paper that I used on this was the Holtz cardstock called Departed. So it already had a nice pattern background with some grunge, but you can definitely add more to it by stamping on it like I did with the postcard topper. Or even just some other stamps. I added the one stamp here called Destination, and I kind of used it as one of the buildings. But get creative with your stamps. You can certainly add to the background. And then to make that postcard topper pop, I did add some of distress glaze, and that's always a nice addition. And then finally, on the buildings, I did add some yellow distress crayon, just to make it look like the lights were a little bit shining inside of the buildings. So those are some of the details that I did on this particular card, and we are going to go ahead and create a card, but we're going to make some slight variations, so let's just jump right in. Alright, so like the first card, I am adding some washi tape to the edge of the black cardstock, and this is just to make it look like it's a pattern cardstock. Sometimes when I have some cardstock that I want to layer, but I don't necessarily want to use a full designer piece, I'll use my washi tape just around the edges, especially when I'm layering, because that's really all you're going to see. Now, I really liked this particular washi tape because it was black with the brown, and it matched nicely, so that's what I decided to stick with. But certainly you can try any of your washi tape to edge the black cardstock to give yourself just a little bit more design. Now, on the first card that I created, I ended up putting the washi tape all around the 4 edges, but I found once I had added the Skyline, I really didn't need the washi tape on the bottom. So for my second card, I went ahead and I did not add the washi tape to the bottom of the black cardstock. And then after I had my washi tape all around my edges, I went ahead and got out my designer paper from Holtz to add to the black cardstock. Now, as you can see, with the first card, I used that brown, but when I was getting ready to add it to my black cardstock, I saw the back side, which was what I'm showing you here, and I wanted to go ahead and change it up a little bit, and I still thought that it worked. It looks like a gray London sky, so I thought that the color that I chose still worked, and that's what I decided to go with. So I went ahead and I glued it down using my my glue, which I've shared with you before, my 3-in-1 beacon. And then I'm going to go ahead and add my Skyline. Now, what's really nice about this Skyline die is even though it has the holes for the windows, there still is a lot of space to add your adhesive. So I was able to adhere it with no problem. Now, one thing I did find is when I went to look for some of the supplies that I used on this card, because I always like to link up the supplies at the end of the video, I had a hard time finding this particular die. I know that Sizzix does not keep their dies available forever. So if there's a particular die that you like out there, I would recommend grabbing it. This was one that I grabbed because I knew that it was going to be a very good die to use through the years. And sometimes I'll do that. I might not particularly have an idea in mind for a particular die, but if I know that I like it, then I definitely grab it, because there's been too many times where I'll go back, a year later looking for a die and I just can't find it. Now, for the second card, I decided to try something a little bit different. I decided to go ahead and pop it up to make it look more like a 3D card. And I had mixed feelings about this as I went along, and I'll share those with you when I get to that point. But I definitely liked the pop-up element. I liked the way that it did look 3D for the card. And if I didn't have the Mary Poppins hovering over the city, I would definitely have loved this 100%. And while I didn't necessarily not like it, I just found when I was adhering my Mary Poppins, there was a little bit of a challenge because I did have that 3D effect. But in any case, I went ahead and I added my foam tape and I aligned my buildings so that way the top buildings were in the middle of the other buildings to make it look like a really traditional skyline. Now, one thing that I would recommend prior to you adhering your skyline, especially if you're going to add the foam tapes to the background, is if you're going to do any stamping, do that ahead of time. I didn't, but it ended up being all right for me because I only had the one stamp at the top of the card. But if you are going to be adding any additional stamping to your background, you're going to want to do that before you add your second skyline die. Okay, so now that I have my skyline attached, I want to go ahead and start putting together the details. And I wanted to have my moon, and I ended up using my circle punch. But if you wanted a bigger moon, just pull out one of your circle dies and get as big of a moon as you would like. I didn't want to cover too much of my background because that's really what I liked about the card is the cardstock. So I went with a smaller moon, but I could still have my Mary Poppins be a silhouette on top of the moon along with her umbrella. So it worked fine for me. Okay, so like I said in the beginning, I did end up layering 4 of my Mary Poppins dies, and this is because I wanted it to stand up a little bit more. And as you add each layer, the piece becomes really stiff. It's really nice. It's not very flimsy, especially with some of these thinner pieces like the boots and the hand. They're pretty thin, but as you start to layer, they become pretty, I guess, thicker is what I want to say, and they're not as flimsy. So that really is nice, especially with the smaller pieces on these dies. So when I cut out my dies, especially when I know I'm going to be layering, I use double-sided adhesive, and then I cut my dies. So I'll add the adhesive to my black cardstock, and then I'll run it through my Big Shot to cut them out. And then that way, when I go to layer my images, it's just really easy because they already have the stickiness from the double-sided tape. And like I said, I added 4 layers to my Mary Poppins. And then another thing, like I said, when you have the 4 layers, your images are a little bit thicker and easier to work with if you are going to use your sanding paper to sand off some of the edges. With the blackout paper, you have the Kraft color at the back of, on the back side. So when you get your sander out and you start to sand the black part off, you can see some of that Kraft come through, and it just really helps to grunge it up a little bit more. When I was playing with the images, the first one that I did, I actually took a lot more of the black off, but I really didn't like that. So in the end, I decided just to use my sander to take off some of the black on the edge. So that way my silhouette image was still pretty much intact. Okay, so at this point, the overall layout of the background is pretty much intact. So now we're going to get to the details. So as you saw on my first card, I did have a moon, and I could have simply just glued it right down, but I wanted to go ahead and mute the moon a little bit. Mute the moon. Say that 3 times quickly. So I went ahead and I added some Distress ink, and I'm using Walnut stain, but Vintage Photo would work just as well. And then after I get my ink on my moon, I'm going to go ahead and set it aside, because at this point I realized that I had forgotten to add my postcard stamp at the top. So this wasn't a big deal for me, because I was able to still use my Misty to get a nice crisp stamp. But again, if you are going to do a lot of stamping on your background, I recommend you do it before you actually add your Skyline. Now the ink that I'm using for my stamp is Memento, but instead of using the black that I typically use, I'm using the color that's called Rich Cocoa. And this is a brown tone, just to kind of go along with my vintage theme. And I ended up inking this up a couple of times and stamping it to get a nice image. But as you can see, with the busy background, it still didn't show up very nicely. But I was fine with this, because I knew once I added my Distress Glaze, it was going to pop. And sure enough, once I got my Distress Glaze out and I added it to my stamped image, I was able to get that shiny postcard image to pop just like I knew it would. Now, if you've never used a Distress Glaze, it's just like your embossing powders, but it's translucent. So I know Tim Holtz does a lot of videos on these. And I really like it because it adds some nice color to the background. I have most of the colors, I believe, and I don't use them enough. I find that a lot of my mixed media product has been sitting for a while, so I'm going to really try to bring out some of that on my next several videos to share with you some of those techniques. But the Distress Glaze, again, it's just like an embossing powder. You're going to want to add it to your wet ink, so that way it does hold the powder. And then you're just going to get out your embossing heat tool to emboss it up. And as you can see, as it dries, you get that really shiny effect and a nice dark image that really shows up through a busy background. Okay, so once we have that taken care of, we can go ahead and continue with finishing up the card. And as I indicated, I did add some of that walnut stain to the moon, which muted it down just a bit. Now, if you like the bright yellow moons, by all means, you don't have to add the ink, but I wanted to have a little bit of shadow, and I find that the brown ink works really nicely for that. All right, so because I'm working with a smaller moon, my Mary Poppins figure isn't going to be right in the middle of it. So I'm just trying to figure out exactly the placement for my figure, because she is going to be holding an umbrella. And this is what I alluded to early on in the video. For my first card, I didn't have the 2 layers, so I was able to just stick my Mary Poppins right on the top of my Skyline. But because I popped up the second part of the Skyline, I kind of had to maneuver it a little bit. So just keep that in mind when you're deciding to go with the flat Skyline or the popped up Skyline. Now for the umbrella, I didn't layer it 4 times, but I did layer it twice. And the reason behind that is on my first card, I did layer it 4 times, but I found when I went to put the umbrella handle underneath Mary Poppins' hand, it didn't, the hand was awkward because of the height of the handle. So I chose to actually just layer it twice to give it a little bit of dimension, but not as much as the Mary Poppins figure. And then once I had it in place, I went ahead and just added some extra adhesive to make sure that that thin umbrella pole wasn't going to tear or rip. That's one of the things with some of these die cuts. You have to be really careful. Some of these pieces are so thin and so delicate, and I find just by layering it just gives it a little bit more sturdiness. Okay, so now we're coming into the final phases of the design. And as you can see, I've already got my Mary Poppins and the umbrella adhered, along with the skyline and the moon. So now I'm going to come in with some washi tape. And the washi tape that I'm using is from an older collection called Humidor. And this is the one that has the cigar labels. But it really has some great brown tones, and that's why I chose to go with it. I think I have this set in my shop, and like I always do for you, I'll link all of the products that I've used. I may not be able to find the Skyline, but if I have a chance, what I'll do is I'll cut some out and I'll create some sets for you with that Skyline. So that way, if you do want to go ahead and copy this design, you'll be able to have the Skyline in your stash. So I got my washi tape adhered, and then I just got some brads and I just added them to the edge of the washi tape just for additional decor, just to give it some more interest. And then I am going to add a metal element on the card like I did for the first one. And this metal element reads, "See the world." On the first card, the element that I used, that round metal element, said "Free to fly." So while it's appropriate, it's not necessarily anything specific to Mary Poppins, but it does seem to work with the overall design. And then finally, once I have my brads adhered, I'm going to go ahead and glue this panel to my Kraft cardstock, and then that will go right directly onto my white card base. The one final touch that I did on both the cards is I did add some of the yellow distress crayon to the open windows, and all I did was just swipe that crayon over the open notches and then smear it with my finger. When I'm creating these cards, I don't worry about it being perfect. I like it to be a little bit grungy and a little bit off. But if you need for it to be perfect into the windows, then you may want to just add some yellow cardstock underneath those open slots, so that way you won't have the smudge like I do on my card. All right, so that pretty much does it. I hope that you've enjoyed my walkthrough of putting together this Mary Poppins themed card using the new set from Tim Holtz called The Park. So as always, I'll leave a list of all the products that I've used to create the card along with the links to the store. And if you've enjoyed my video, I would really appreciate a thumbs up. The thumbs up actually do help the channel, and they do make it so it's viewable for additional YouTubers. So that thumbs up, while you might think it's just a little thing, it really does help the video. So I appreciate any thumbs up you can give me on my videos. And don't forget, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I am hoping to get at least one video out a week. I am really busy with my job recently, but I always like to take time to craft. And whenever I am putting together these projects, I love to be able to just turn on the camera and share with you my process. And then as a reminder, don't forget, you guys, I do have a Facebook group where you can also share your projects, and I would love to see any projects that you create. So I'll make sure that I leave links to my Facebook group below, so you can join and share your makes as well. And then finally, if you aren't subscribed to my shop, my blog, you might want to head over to tailormadecardsforyou.com and subscribe, because I do often add vintage freebies for you to use in your crafting, and you are the first to be notified of any sales that I may have for some of the product in my shop. All right, everybody. Well, I hope again that you've enjoyed the video, and we'll see you again next time.